Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. Good to have you back again. Hi, Mike. Good to have you here. Let's, before we get into John chapter 19 this time, let's mention that the Divine Counsel Worldview Conference is coming up in October. And I think you have a slide there or two here, Mike, to explain. Tell the folks the dates and where this is going to be.
The Divine Counsel Worldview Conference will be on October 9th, 2026, starting at 3 p.m., and we'll go through October 10th at 6 p.m. So it's about a day and a half, about more than a little bit over a day total for the conference at Flatirons Community Church. It's their West Campus in Golden, Colorado.
Sounds fun. My topic, I know what my title will be. Does a DCW recommend a specific doctrine of salvation? That's my topic, and I have not seen the topic titles of the other folks. Has that been advertised yet?
Yes, we do. So we have a few other speakers as well. Joe Mudamale on the Ascension as the fulfillment of Psalm 82. Matt Halstead, Prayer, Human Identity, and the Supernatural Worldview. You mentioned your talk, Ron, and Doug Van Dorn is going to be talking on the Cosmic War and the Sons of God.
There we go. A lot of fun. Thank you. And I hope you guys can make it. Hope anyone that's listening can make it to this in October 8th and 9th. Last time we got together was last May, is in Indianapolis, and it was kind of a spur of the moment conference, but boy, was that a lot of fun to meet a lot of you and to have a good conversation, not just officially, but around the lunch table and so forth. So we welcome you to come. All right, let me share my screen. And we're going to jump into John chapter 19. It's interesting as we get into this that, let's talk about chronology again, that the one verse that's in John 19 that tells us where we are, not that you wouldn't know by just following the story, is John 19:14, that preparation day of Passover, or the day before Passover was there. And so we can tell that it's on a Friday of this Passion Week. This is the day that Jesus, of course, will die as we get into John 19. We're also, as we jump in the first verse, we'll notice we are right in the middle of the fourth, or really the sixth trial that Jesus will be going through. In the book of John, we have four trials mentioned: Annas, Caiaphas, and Pilate twice. And the way Pilate's handled actually is one long account. So we are right in the middle of what John will have, the book of John, as the third trial of Jesus. This of course, is in front of Pilate, the Roman procurator that has been placed in Judea to keep order since about 26 AD. He will last until about 36 AD. We'll talk about him more coming up. But let's jump in. Verse 1. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. We are in, my first thought when I read that, Mike, is this is not intellectual material. This is devotional material. We are in sacred space, sacred time, in a very sacred text. When we talk about the sufferings and the death of our Savior, John gives a lot of time to it, and we are right on top of it now. And so as I studied for this, it struck me, this is not something you study for intellectually. This is something that is meant to seep into your soul. I forget the exact story that N.T. Wright tells, and if any of our listeners want to scour AI, they can probably find the exact definition or the exact story that N.T. Wright tells. But he once told the story of three boys who were spurious, little kids basically, and the rector or the priest, for punishment, said, I want you to go into the chapel and look up at the cross and say, I don't care that you died for me. I want you to say it 3 times. And that'll be your penance for what you've done. There was some little thing they had done. And And Wright then tells the story, or ends the story there, because he had heard that, And then one day at one of his speaking engagements, a man came up to him. Hey, have you ever heard this story? It's fascinating. And said, Dr. Wright, I was one of those boys, and it changed my life. I remember looking up at the cross, saying, I don't care that you died for me, and I couldn't say it. And by the third time that I tried to get the words out, I just broke down, and I've never been the same man again. So all to say that the death of our Savior is meant to be a emotional and spiritual event for us all. Anyway, so then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. They came up to him saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him. Now, we have talked about Pilate before, and it is interesting. This is from, I think, chapter 18's study, when I mentioned that Pilate Day is celebrated each June 25th within the Coptic Christian tradition in Ethiopia, suggesting that some early Christians believe that he and his wife may have ultimately turned around, repented, and come to faith in Christ. There is a strong tradition, in other words, within the Coptic Church, that Pilate did become a believer. And as we listen to Pilate's own words, even in John 19, I'll highlight some of them as we go along. It does strike me that these are, in one sense, the words of a man who respects Jesus. Now, whether he believes enough to change his worship is one question. Does he respect Jesus by the time he even hands him over to be crucified? I think that's unequivocally yes. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, Behold the man. I think just means, here's the guy that you've been wanting me to put in front of you. Here he is. When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, Crucify him, crucify him. Now, this has been a question on my mind, I know, going way back when I was a student of the Bible. Because of Acts 7, right, where Stephen is stoned, why didn't they cry out, stone him, instead of crucify him? And maybe people have heard this before, but it's good to kind of set the record. By this point, only Rome could legally carry out capital punishment in this area. So when Pilate initially told the Jewish leaders to take Jesus yourselves, judge him according to your law, and then they respond with, well, it's not lawful for us to put a man to death. They're speaking accurately. It was not lawful for the Jewish Sanhedrin to put a man to death in execution style. Whether this statement reflects an absolute legal prohibition or just a practical reality, we're not sure, but the writer clearly wants readers to understand that Jews needed Pilate's authorization to kill Jesus. And he wasn't overseeing a stoning. That's not how Romans did things. He only knew of crucifixion. So that's why they yell out, crucify him. Well, and also, I'm not going to read the slide that I have on the screen, but the issue, what's interesting is what they bring initially, and that is blasphemy. Caiaphas gets into this in his trial, which is not in John. When they bring him before Pilate, they subtly move the accusation from blasphemy to political sedition. And there's a difference, because a Roman really doesn't care about blasphemy against Yahweh. That's not his concern. But a Pilate would be concerned about political sedition. And in America, again, we have a hard time imagining this. We just don't see it in our news. But if you go to Turkey or an Arab country, the idea of political insurrection is, North Korea, it is punishable by prison and or death. So this idea of a king of the Jews opposing Caesar, that's what is going to bring a punishable statement or sentence against Jesus. And that, of course, would end with crucifixion and not stoning. One more point I'd like to make. Yeah, go ahead.
So it's kind of funny that you brought up the whole entire thing, that question about why didn't they cry, stone him? I think recently we did talk about this on the other podcast I help out with at Awakening. And one of the little bits of information that we gleaned was that there was this transition period between, I guess, Pilate and another, governor, essentially. And the high priest took the opportunity to use that kind of moment when there's a transition in governmental power to have James, the brother of Jesus, executed. Mm-hmm. And they did it by stoning him. Basically, just like, the vigilante type justice. And the whole entire story goes is that when the new governor did come in and then heard about what had happened, because a lot of people were upset that James was murdered, essentially, in the between time between one Roman governor to another, that the people reported it to the new governor, who was incensed and basically disposed of the high priest, kicked him out. And so there are political consequences. And that's probably why that if they were going to do this, they wanted it to be the Romans to do it, in a sense, so that everything was properly done and that the high priest could not be found culpable.
Interesting. Hey, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Theologically, I also want to add, as we close this idea down, that Jesus had repeatedly predicted what kind of death he would die. In other words, mm-hmm. It can't be, or it wouldn't be, suicide or a mob that just lynches him or something like that. So in chapter 12, when I'm lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. And the text even says this talks about what kind of death he was going to die by, which of course sounds like a crucifixion, being lifted off the earth. So a Roman execution fulfills, interestingly, and maybe even retrospectively, Jesus' prediction that he would die under a curse. And of course, that comes out of Deuteronomy 21, which says in Torah that a person who is hung on a tree is accursed by Elohim. So the very standard of, or the thought, or the visual, shall we say, of seeing a person hanging on a tree, which in the crucifixion, that's how you'd look. That is a way of being able to say to yourself, well, that man is cursed by God. And of course, the opposite is happening. Jesus is not being cursed. He's being obedient. He's being faithful. And so that's where that interesting, reversal is going to happen. That what looks like a person being rejected by God, if you had passed by that day and seen it, you would have said, this man is being rejected. Well, the opposite is happening. He's being faithful to the very God that loves him and the God he loves. So I think that's important as well. When we think of how the sufferings of Jesus come into our life, to me, this is encouraging. We all have suffering at some point, and if you don't have it now, wait a week and you'll have something happen, right? And the idea that our sufferings somehow match Jesus' sufferings is a theme. It's an actual theme of the New Testament. It's not incidental that Jesus will suffer before he dies. And the New Testament writers will pick that up. They'll carry that through their writings. And 3 times in Romans 8, 1 Peter 4, and Philippians 3, the writer makes the clear point that Jesus' sufferings is to be reenacted, if I may even use that idea, or participated in the fellowship of his sufferings, koinonia with his sufferings, Paul will say. And the idea that when we suffer with Christ, whatever kind of suffering we have, that as we suffer with him, there will be eternal reward on the other side, much like it was for Jesus. So the suffering of Jesus is a great theme of the Bible, and it's not something that we want to pass over too quickly. Well, Pilate continues, take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. It's one of the 3 times that Pilate just comes out and says, I have no reason to find him guilty. The Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God. And again, I've often wondered this. It's a good question that theologians have bantered about over the years. What is wrong with a man claiming to be the Messiah? I mean, it's one thing to lie or to be deceptive about it, but is the claim to be the Son of God or the Messiah, which is a really appositional way of saying the same thing, Son of God or Messiah. What's blasphemous, shall we say, about the very idea of claiming to be, even if you're not, but is the idea of claiming it blasphemous? And the short answer is no. There was no law written into Torah or into any kind of rabbinic writing that a person who claimed to be the Messiah was to be killed. There is no law for that. And in fact, we know from Second Temple Judaism going forward that there were individuals who thought of themselves or were thought of by others to be messianic. We have two names, in fact, in the book of Acts, Judas the Galilean, Acts 5, and Theudas, also in Acts 5, who claimed to be the Messiah. Simon Bar Kokhba in the second rebellion in 135-ish AD also claimed to be a Messiah, and many people thought he was. Notice they weren't killed. In fact, usually they were just ignored by Rome. So claiming to be a Messiah by itself was not a capital offense. So my question, or let me pose it very carefully, why then were the Jewish leaders so upset? And I think, here's my opinion, Mike, see what you think. Throughout John's gospel, Jesus' relationship to the Father has been unique. I think this is what has caught their attention. He just doesn't say, oh, I'm Messiah, which he actually never does. But he claims to be everything that a Messiah would be and more. He came from the Father, shares his glory, his authority, gives life to mankind. I mean, this is beyond a Messiah. He receives worship. Nothing in the Old Testament would suggest that you would worship the Messiah, and yet Jesus gladly accepts, worship. And he is, again, to judge the world at the hand of Yahweh. So by this time, I think what's happening is the Jews are understanding Jesus to be claiming far much more than simple messiahship. And then add one cosmic element to this that's not uncommon or unknown to a DCW mind, and that is that the leaders were speaking for the gods they were worshiping. I can't get out of my mind, again, John 8:44, your father is the devil, and you always do what he wants you to do. So in one sense, when these Jewish leaders are crying out that Jesus is blaspheming and is deserving of death, I think they're mouthing what the rebellious spirits themselves knew about Daniel 7 and the prediction of the Son of Man who would come and reclaim authority over the nations that Yahweh had once given to these beings. So I think there's a cosmic element certainly in mind here, as well as just the physical, men that are upset about who Jesus claims to be. Any thoughts there?
I mean, I think I would actually say that they had a technical claim that he was committing blasphemy, at least from their perspective. Because like Leviticus 24:16 says that anyone who blasphemes the name of Yahweh is to be put to death. Right. And so the entire assembly must stone them, whether foreigner or native born. When they blaspheme the name, they are to be put to death. And so then the question is it because he claimed to be Messiah? No. But it's because of his specific claim that he is the Son of God, or specifically in their minds, the Son of the Father. And thus, there seems to be this moment of how dare you connect yourself that intimately and that closely to the name, right? And so thus that to them would be blasphemy. And so technically they are right, because in their minds, he is just a human being. Just a human being. There's no way that he could be more than that. And so that's why they couldn't perceive it, and that's why they from their limited perspective could say that we're doing the right thing, even though it surely is not the right thing.
Yeah. I'm just imagining, why would a person, you basically have two sides yelling at each other, kill him, or no, he deserves, he is who he said he is. What would cause a person to step on either side of that line? And obviously the work of the Holy Spirit within a person's heart and mind, I think we always have to add that in. But is there something objectively factual in front of the audience that would cause a person to say yes and another person to say no when it came to who Jesus was. Again, my suspicion is it comes down to something deeper than just the physical question that's in front of you. There's probably a spiritual tie going on. In other words, my ties are to a different deity, and that deity wants to kill Jesus, right? And so I can't get that out of my mind. But again, do the Pharisees and Sadducees that want Jesus to die, do they openly worship another deity? Of course, they would say no. But Jesus has spent a lot of time in John saying, you don't know the Father. You do not know him. If you had known him, you would love me, and you know, those kind of things. So there's certainly a spiritual
I think that is
a spiritual story going on.
I think that's granted, like that there is a spiritual element that they may not be conscious of. They probably weren't, for the most part, conscious of it. There were probably a lot of other vested interests that were brought into mind. We have to protect ourselves. We have to make sure the Romans don't think that we're encouraging sedition. Like all these various reasons and rationalizations for what they were about to do. But it is interesting because I do think the factor of the Holy Spirit affecting someone's own perspective and heart does come into play more often than we realize. Even when you mention it, I could think of actually one person that's been coming to my church recently in the last half year. And this person was actually very involved within Islam, actually in the local major kind of power structures of Islam within the Boston area. And this person, after many, many years, eventually just came to this realization, there is no way that Jesus could be just a human being. He couldn't just be a prophet. Mm-hmm. He has to be God. And because of that conviction, the person resigned from their position and then started going to churches and wanting to finally learn more about who Jesus truly was. But this person basically just had this conviction. There's no way that he was just a man. Mm-hmm. And so when this person told us, there was no doubt in my mind. There was no way this person could have come to this kind of conclusion or just deep realization unless it was the Spirit working within the heart for all these years.
Yep, I totally believe that the difference between me and the non-believer is not me. it's the Spirit working in me and working in you. All right, thank you. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. It's interesting at the end of this when they say, what's the statement? He has made himself the Son of God. And then the next thing you hear is Pilate is afraid, more afraid. I think it's because in his mind, I mean, again, where he is with the Holy Spirit on this question is never stated, but you wonder where his sense of conviction was. Pilate, entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Jesus will be silent for a few moments here. This headquarters, praetorium is the term that's even in Greek there, is when you go to Jerusalem even today and you stand on the Temple Mount, which is in white in the picture there, and look west into the old city. The praetorium, from what we can tell, is on just inside the western Jaffa Gate. Today it's near the Tower of David. And that's where we understand, or we think, most archaeologists believe the praetorium of Herod would be. It's of Herod. And Pilate uses it. He comes in from Caesarea and uses this praetorium. In the temple model that's at the Israeli Museum, which is so helpful when you go over there to stand or to walk around this model, the last Passover is traditionally thought of to be somewhere in West Jerusalem. We're not sure, but it's celebrated in a building that's in West Jerusalem. And then, of course, they would have traveled across the Kidron Valley into Gethsemane, which is on the eastern side of the temple proper. But then that means that when, to be brought into Herod's or Pilate's courtyard or his praetorium, he would have been on the west side of the city. So that's where it would be. that we would be looking at. It does remind me that, and this is finalized with the end of the war in Iraq or Iran. We've been able to make sure everything is a go for our Israel tour, November 8 to 18, and certainly welcome anyone who has 10 days to spend to go to Israel. This is not sponsored by the Divine Council or the Michael S. Heiser Foundation. Just understand it's separate. But I've been invited to be one of the speakers for this tour, and we will be spending 3 days, the first 3 days of the tour, in Jerusalem. So if there's any chance that you could join us in November 8 to 18, I'm thinking this would be a great Christmas present for someone, obviously an expensive one, but even like your pastor, if you have any way of helping your pastor learn what a DCW is or be comfortable with the Divine Council worldview, this would be a fire hose moment, these 10 days, because I'll be speaking at all these sites about what a Divine Council worldview has to do with Israel itself and the archaeology that we'll be studying. So contact me at ronjohnson7@gmail.com if you have any interest in going this fall. All right, so continuing with the story. Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Well, that does make Jesus want to answer, and he says, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above." It does remind us, and there's a lot to say here, but I'll just go over some of the main issues that, of course, are in hand here when it comes to a DCW read on this kind of statement. Let me just read what I have here. There is good evidence that Jesus understood his passion as a unique period in which Satan would be permitted to exercise a limited temporary authority. In other words, you've had statements like in John 12 and John 14, the ruler of this world is coming. The ruler of the world will be cast out. Now, we have to insist that this authority that we're talking about for Satan was always subordinate to God's sovereign plan. At no point in any story of the Bible, of course, does Satan get outside of the ultimate authority and superiority, right, of God himself. So it's not as though the devil was taking control away from God, but he is allowed to act during this week of Jesus' life in a certain unique way. And so this coming conflict is not considered to be a defeat of Jesus, though it will appear so. And wouldn't you know, Satan, what he wants to get out of this will be just the opposite. What he is dealt will be defeat, even though he wants to have a triumph. Again, if a person would like to read what I have on the screen, they're certainly welcome to use this kind of material to think through how the devil was involved during this unique week of Jesus' life. It does give rise to the question or the idea that Satan enters Judas during this time period. Maybe prior to the Passion Week, Judas was not under the spell, as it were, of Satan as much as he will be during this week. In John 13, we have that Satan entering Judas statement made. And so, interestingly, again, this is in Luke, but when Peter is told by Jesus that, quote, Satan demanded to have you that he may sift you like wheat, you get the feeling you're back to the book of Job, where Satan obtained permission from God to test a certain righteous person. And Jesus doesn't deny that Satan's request was real, but he assures Peter in the Luke story that he was prayed for and that his faith would not ultimately fail. So it's a fascinating, again, give and take about the limited power that God is allowing Satan to have or not have over people during this time. And of course, we know this from Paul's writings, where he will say in 1 Corinthians 2:8, none of the rulers of this age understood Jesus' death, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So, long story short, what Satan will be attempting to do will be another great reversal, and that what looks like the defeat of Jesus and the ending of his life and his own death will actually be a means of God's victory. So it's all part of a great story that anyone involved in a DCW mindset would understand, because this is where it's all coming, where the story is coming to a climax and coming to an end. So the devil's hour is actually God's hour, the way it'll actually work. All right. Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore," and he has this interesting phrase. It's a curious spin of logic. "Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." And we've wondered, why would Jesus say the greater sin? And I think it just means that it's not inexcusable what Pilate's doing. He's just saying that Pilate is guilty and someone else is more guilty, because maybe Pilate is working from a sense of ignorance to some degree, or doesn't want to do what he does, but he ends up doing it anyway. So the logic will work like this. God has permitted Pilate to exercise judicial authority, and in condemning an innocent man, maybe even in ignorance or against his better judgment. On the other hand, the Jewish leaders, or Judas, depending on who this person is that handed me over, you could argue both ways, they're acting with greater knowledge and greater intent. And so one of the themes of the Bible, this goes all the way back to the Old Testament, all sins are not the same. And some sins are done because of boredom, impatience, lust, whatever. And then there are those kinds of sins, like this one, where Jesus says, "The one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin." That there are some sins that do, yes, get God's attention on the level of a certain heinousness. These 7 things the Lord hates. Or how's it go in Proverbs 6? "These 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination to him." So the idea that some things offend God more than others is simply a truth of the Bible that we've often forgotten, I think, because we want to make all sins the same. I don't know why we do that, but that's what I was taught. And really, it's quite clear that Jesus has in mind a greater concupiscence here, or a greater liability based on what someone has done in front of him. From then on, again, notice how Pilate, I feel for the man, because I think he's caught. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt here. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. I take that as an honest statement. He really did want to let him go. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend." Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. And those 2 last words, opposes Caesar, made him afraid. He was a weak man in the sense that he was willing to kill one man to save his skin. I grant that. Did he think Jesus was guilty of sedition? I think if you had pulled him aside, he would have said no. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic or Hebrew, Golgotha. Again, here is a bird's eye view of the model of Jerusalem in the day of Jesus. And there on the western side of the hill, or against the western wall, outside wall, you have the Praetorium, or the site where Herod would have governed from. It would be his palace, and the site that Pilate would use when he comes in from Caesarea during a time like Passover. And what's interesting is today, this is one of the stops we'll make in Jerusalem. When you're walking along that outside wall, now these are 15th century walls, 16th century Suleiman. So what you're seeing there, that outside wall is probably the same line, or the same airspace as the original wall of Jerusalem, but it's been rebuilt. What's interesting, though, is you come upon this structure right in front of you, and if you turn a direct left-hand turn and face the wall, here's what you see. And it has been determined by archaeologists that what you're experiencing here is an ancient gate, where the 2 sides there of those 2 shortened walls, and then stairs, and just past those ladies up onto the left, you can see the evidence of, well, what's called what people think is to be the stone pavement, or what they call in Hebrew Golgotha, because that word Golgotha means, and here's from the Holman Illustrated Bible Dictionary, it means elevation, a platform in front of the praetorian or governor's palace in Jerusalem where Pilate sat in judgment over Jesus in this verse, pronouncing the sentence to crucify Jesus. And the point is that this was probably, again, if you go back to the picture, a gate that was just that allowed a person to go into the praetorium. So this would be where a king or a tetrarch or a leader like Pilate would have experienced the crowd. He would have come out of this gate and sat in a place, an elevated place, and pronounced judgment. So that's an interesting site to visit today. It's again, right up against the wall there, and we'll do that. Now, it was the day of the preparation of the Passover again, so we're talking Friday before Saturday, High Saturday, Sabbath. It was about the 6th hour, which would make it noon. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." Again, I think these are words said honestly. He's not joking around. I think he honestly believes that Jesus is who he said he was. They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, again, I think he says this in all sincerity, "Shall I crucify your king?" To him that made no sense. The chief priests answered, now they're being political about this, "We have no king but Caesar." Imagine how things have flipped, where the Jews are arguing for Caesar and Pilate is arguing probably for Jesus. And here is his mistake. It clearly is a mistake. He delivered him, Jesus, over to them to be crucified. He lets the crowd have its way. And I think this will go with him to the grave. So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross. We've probably all heard the story again that a man would be forced to carry the top bar that he would be fastened to the place where the crucifixion would take place, which was probably an elevated area. It doesn't have to be too high. And then it would be nailed to the stump or the remains of a tree, probably, so that the cross is made up of a bar across, a crossbar onto which a person was either tied or nailed, and then that would be put up onto a dead tree. Probably not very high off the ground, just high enough off that they can't touch the ground. So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, in Aramaic again, or in Hebrew, Golgotha. This gives evidence that John's readership is probably living, well, tradition says Ephesus, that the readership of the original book of John is somewhere outside of Judea, because he's telling people locations based on what he hopes they can figure out based on the name of something. So Golgotha. What's hard, again, about going to Jerusalem is that today, and here's an overhead view of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This would be the site of Jesus' death. And Mike, you've been there, I believe, right? You're right in the middle of the old city of Jerusalem. And then when you go in, it's so adorned by thousands of years of religious trinkets and religious tradition, that the idea of a crucifixion or a hill upon which Jesus is crucified, I think, is really lost, to your senses. If you go again back to the Jerusalem model at the Israeli Museum, they have shown a place just outside of the wall. This would be outside of the wall of that time, an area that more likely would be where Jesus was crucified. It would be outside, just past the temple area. You see the little gate there, and this would be an area that would be outside the city wall. Very clearly, again, Hebrews 13, he was crucified outside the gate, and there's theological import to that in the end. And the difficulty, of course, in how you've envisioned this today is that same spot is now built over by centuries of a church. So some have thought, and this goes back to the late 1800s, there's a rock-facing quarry, or a quarry that has been dug out, and the rock that has been left And you see it less now than you used to see it even back in the 70s when I first went to Israel. The face of a skull, or the face of, two eye sockets. And some people have thought this, it's called Gordon's Calvary by Cyrus Gordon, who saw this and thought this was Golgotha. But there's very, very little evidence that this is where it is. This is outside of the Damascus Gate to the north of the old city, and there's a bus station there now. So it's not far from here where we have found the Garden Tomb, by the way. Actually,
I was at that site before too when I was in Israel.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember seeing the outline and the look of the what appears to be a skull.
Yeah.
Actually, I did also want to ask quickly, Ron, did you ever hear of, it's an idea that some researchers are trying to verify, but that the reference to Golgotha is a reference to supposedly the location of where David buried Goliath's skull.
Didn't know that. I've not heard that.
One of my Hebrew professors at Gordon, that was one of the theories that he mentioned to us, that because quick short, if people don't remember, David, yes, he kills Goliath with the stone, but he also, for good measure, takes Goliath's own sword, whacks his head off, and basically takes his head and eventually kind of shows it in front of the folks in Salem. And idea being that, what I did to him, we're eventually going to do to you. And supposedly the legend is that he buried it somewhere outside of the city of Salem, which eventually would become Jerusalem. Okay. And so there is a thought that, wouldn't it be interesting if Jesus's cross was actually placed on the same ground where the skull of Goliath was?
Yeah. Interesting possibility.
Anyways, it's a possibility. It's I was never able to find an actual peer-reviewed journal that talked about this. So I could never include it in one of the papers I had to write for my class.
Yeah,
but I tried to ask my professor, and it's like, where are the references? But he couldn't remember where he had read it before. So it was like, I can't use that then.
Can't wait to find out. Yeah. There they crucified him with him two others. The other Gospels talk about conversations, of course, that Jesus has with those two. One on either side, and Jesus between them. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Again, I believe he was being honest in his own mind. Many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. Again, remember that picture. It's right outside the gate. And it was written in 3 languages, Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, just so everybody could know. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but rather this man said or claimed, I am the King of the Jews. And of course, Pilate's answer is, no, what I've written, I have written. I take that again to mean I do believe that he is the King of the Jews. We'll get to this in just a moment, but just because a person believes that Jesus is the Messiah does not necessarily make them a Christian in our modern sensibility, and I'll discuss that coming up. Well, actually, it's right here. I knew this was coming. But go back to Matthew 27, and here's what happens. It's a famous moment. When the centurion, this is not in John, this is in Matthew. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place at the moment of Jesus' death, they were filled with awe and said, notice they, not just the centurion, the entire group, they were filled with awe and said, truly, this was the Son of God. Now again, Son of God, I take to mean with Acts 9, verses 20 and 22 in hand, where Paul is preaching and he uses the phrase Messiah, Christ, and Son of God appositionally, as though one means the other. That when this Roman centurion, let's use him as the example, looked at Jesus and said, yep, this was the Messiah. What would that mean for that person's salvation, shall we say, to make, to tie up loose ends right away? Here's my opinion. I'll see what you think, Mike. It would be like saying this. Think of the centurion saying this. This certainly was the Jewish Messiah. That's what a Messiah is. He's the Jewish king. But I'm a Gentile. So this fact means nothing to me and certainly does not change my worship. In other words, if a Roman says he's the Jewish Messiah, you notice how there's a disconnect there because a Roman doesn't care what Jews do with their messiahs. Why would I care? I'm a Roman. I have my own set of gods, Jupiter and so forth. Why would I care about a Jewish Messiah? So I think we often put too much theological meaning into a centurion statement or even a Pilate statement because in one sense, even if Pilate did believe this was the Jewish Messiah, that's not talking in the same language of loyalty and allegiance that we are speaking of when it comes to people becoming, converts in the New Testament. So, in other words, there's another step a person would have to make. The centurion would say, he's the Jewish Messiah, and I'm going to sign up for that story that has been told since, Genesis 1. I'm going to join the family of Abraham, this God that has been taking care of this family, and I'm going to join that family through the worship of this God and this Messiah. And so it's just a different thing to me. That it doesn't mean salvation the way I've often heard it preached. Do you have any opinion on that?
I took note of the descriptor right before the quotation of the centurion where it says he was filled with awe. Yeah. And when I looked it up with my NIV, they actually translated it as they were terrified and exclaimed. When I looked it up, the word itself is the Greek word where we get the word of fear, phobia. And so, and then BDAG itself specifically believes that it's used semantically in the sense of the apprehensive state, become frightened, be afraid. So I don't think it was simply that he was simply making a statement of, truly, this was the Son of God, but I don't really care. It's like, oh no, like there's this sense of dread, of fear, of terror, of what did we just do kind of thing. So now, does that mean it necessarily would mean that this guy would someone, please tell me about Jesus? I don't know. But at the very least, I think the emotion that's being conveyed by Matthew, at least, is that there is this genuine sense of terror amongst the centurion and his fellow soldiers, realizing this man was more than just a man. Something just happened. This is not normal. And I am now scared out of my wits of what just happened. What did we just do? So I think there is a sense of concern of what in the world was this? And who is this guy? And what did we end up doing? Are we in trouble?
All to say, we can't get behind the psychology of so many of the biblical characters, and it'd be better to let them say what they say and not make a judgment call on their spiritual status based on what they say.
Yeah, I don't think we can decide they became followers of Jesus at that moment, but at the very least, it does. I think at least it opens that case of if they're still around the area when the disciples after post-Pentecost are talking about Jesus, if they're still alive.
Yeah.
There's still some thought about if these soldiers are even still alive. Because who knows? Maybe they were the same soldiers that were also meant to guard the stone tomb, and then they had to be silenced somehow. But at the very least, I would say that if the fact that Matthew makes it a point to use that word, that they were afraid, not in reverence, but they were just purely terrified.
Yeah, it was an earthquake, so
there was an earthquake, and earthquakes are usually associated with supernatural events as well, and so there is that sense of, oh no, of dread.
What did we just do? Yeah, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they were continuing in verse 23, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, also his tunic. I guess it's free game. Whatever this man had is now free game for anyone. And that's how they treated people who they put to death. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. I don't think there's any significance in that, but They just noticed it. And so they said, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be. This was to fulfill plerothe, from pleroma, which says, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. That's in Psalm 16. I believe it's verse 22. So again, the writer hears or sees or hears of an event, and it reminds him of an Old Testament text. And in this case, it was David in Psalm 22, or Psalm 16, I'm sorry, who said about his life that he was under such duress that he found that his garments were being this is a statement that David makes. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. And so that connection, even that visual connection between Jesus' garments being sold by casting lots or given away, and David having it happen to him, that's where that word fulfillment comes into play. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother. This seems to be 4 women. His mother, her name is Mary. She's never named in John. All we have is the descriptor, his mother. And his mother's sister, Jesus' aunt, unnamed. Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. So 4 women, 3 of whom were named Mary. Now we know from Matthew 26 as well, a parallel text in a sense. It says all the disciples fled. So in my mind's eye, we have the closest people to Jesus. And of course, Judas has by now, close to this time, we're not sure the timing of his suicide, but he will be, of course, leaving the 12 and committing suicide. So the 11 disciples have fled. They're afraid. Again, political sedition is a serious thing, and so they're afraid for their own lives. Who is left at the cross are 4 valiant, bold women. His mother, his aunt, and 2 women, Mary, the wife of Clopas. I forget, Mark has this Mary being the mother of some of the disciples. I forget which ones. And Mary Magdalene. And we have heard of Mary Magdalene before. We'll mention that coming up. When Jesus saw his mother, this is what's said next, and the disciple whom he loved standing by. Okay, so now we add to the 4 women 1 male, the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, I've argued previously, as you know, Mike, that this is not John the writer, but this would be Lazarus. And you'd have to go back to John, I forget which podcast it was, probably 13, where I made my argument. But in my mind's eye, I see Lazarus and these 4 women. And he said to his mother, Jesus does, "Woman," which is a term of endearment. It's not a odd way of speaking. "Woman, behold your son." Look at me, Mom. And he said to the disciple, that's Lazarus in my mind, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own place, or home is the idea. And again, this to me makes great sense, because the next thing we know about Mary, Acts chapter 1, is she's living in Jerusalem, and she's part of the 120 that are up in the upper room in Acts 1 when they choose the replacement for Judas. So if Mary had gone to live with the Apostle John, he's a Galilean, that would make less sense. It makes good sense that Lazarus, a Judean by trade, and a rich Judean apparently, even though he dies of some ailment, he probably took Mary into his home from then on, and she will become a permanent resident of Judea. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, and tetelestai is used, which is important coming up here, and I'll mention why. He said, to fulfill Scripture, "I thirst." Now, we're not sure what, again, the thirst is fulfilling, but I think it's because of what happens next that the writer ties the Old Testament into this moment. They put a sponge full of sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. This seems to be an event or an act done out of pure evil to make him want to, drink anything that's put in front of him, and it's absolutely sour. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, and here's that word again, tetelestai, it is finished. I've heard it preached that this is a financial term, like a transaction. It is paid, something like that. There's no evidence for that. The word is used, and it has been used by John numerous times, just to mean completed, done, over. It's not just a financial term or a transactional term. It can just mean completed. So whatever you bring into that word is what people are going to get out of the word. And so if you believe that Jesus was paying the price for your sin, then this word is that stamp of payment. It is paid. If you believe that Jesus was suffering by the will of the Father for reasons all unto the Father's will, in other words, there's no reasoning that is, logically being played out here. There's no payment being made, as it were. The same thing is true, that Jesus says, in a sense, it's done. My path of faithfulness to this moment, as tough as it has been, is now done. It is complete. So it doesn't have to be a term of transaction at all. And I just want people to know that. He bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Jesus will die purposely when he feels it's time. Were you going to say?
Ron, can I mention?
Yeah.
You said earlier where there was a point where he mentions, yes, that he thirsts and that this was meant to fulfill the scripture. There was not directly mentioned which scripture. A couple of months ago during the whole entire Lent season, I preached on Psalm 22, and one of the things I discovered in the research for that sermon was Psalm 22 was utilized by the gospel writers, including John. And John's version is a lot more allusions. But in Psalm 22, there is the moment where it is said, my mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. And that
there we go. So the I thirst fulfills that statement of how dry he was. Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
And that also at the end of that same psalm, it says, they will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. That phrasing is actually more similar to what Jesus echoed out at the end when he says finished.
It is finished. It is complete. Whatever the purpose of God in having Jesus die a horrific, painful, persecuted death, whatever the purpose of that was, Jesus knew that time had come, and he had been faithful to the end. So, since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, they're so worried about the ritualistic idea of leaving a body on the Sabbath that they're willing to kill a man over it. That's crazy to me. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, just to speed up their death, of course, because on a cross you could last even up to days on the cross in that time. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. A lot of preaching has been done on that again. We are never told in the text what the significance of blood and water is. My guess would be the closest we can come is the next thing that's said, which is, he who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth. In other words, there's something about the eyewitness concept that makes it important that when he saw blood and water come out, the next thing the writer says is, and we know that he was right there. So there seems to be some kind of eyewitness issue that is born out of that. And my guess, again, I'm not, I have no better opinion than the next guy on this. I think it has to do with a proof of death, something like that, where blood and water coming out of a person was the Romans' way. In other words, these are professional killers. They know how to discern when a body is dead or not. And when blood and water both came out of the area around the heart, it was in their decision usually that meant he was dead. And thus, that's why you have the next statement. We know that he, whoever the writer is, saw this. So we'll get to this in John 21 in a couple of podcasts from now when we talk about this third person who is being brought into the story. He who saw it. It's not the writer. He's talking about someone else. That you may also believe, for these things took place, that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And again, they will look on him whom they have pierced. He's pulling together, I know Zechariah there, and I forget the other one. I didn't write it down. Maybe you have it in front of you, but he's pulling together, the writer is pulling together these pieces of prophetic literature that may not be messianic yet, in the mind of the original readers, but now they become messianic because of how they are played out in the life of Jesus. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him permission. Again, I sense that Pilate's view of this is that now that he's dead, he's going to stay dead, and there's nothing we need to do about it. So he came and took away his body. Nicodemus also. Now we met him again in chapter 3, and I think it's in chapter 7. So this is the third time in John. Who earlier had come to Jesus by night. There's the John 3 reference. Came bringing 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. Why did he bring that? It was because he had no idea. I find this interesting again. Two of these disciples that are willing to put their life on the line and bury Jesus respectably have no concept of the resurrection. They are coming to bury him, and they have no intent of seeing Jesus come to life again, even though he claimed he would. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. So there's that place again where outside the wall, we don't know how to recreate it specifically, of course, but it's going to be not a populated area. It's going to be, certainly Gentile territory, and even a place for a garden. And in the garden, a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. So that's where the book of John ends. Chapter 19. I'm glad the book of John does not end here. This is how John 19 ends, and we've got, of course, two. Next thing we're going to hear is Sunday morning, so we need to get there next time. Anything you want to add as we close up? This is the hard. This is the night before dawn, and we are going to leave Jesus in the tomb. And what's interesting again is that everyone, including the disciples, had no idea what was about to happen, even though they had been told again and again that he was going to rise from the dead. No one believed him.
I did wonder when we were talking about the soldiers, especially when you were mentioning about the blood and water separating. Supposedly, if this is Lazarus, who's the actual eyewitness, I do wonder if the soldier who had to give the certificate or the certification of Jesus' death, if they're connected as well to that Matthew passage about they were all terrified. I do wonder, did any of them come trying seeking answers of like, who was this guy? I'm sure that must have stayed as a locked memory considering the earthquake and everything weird that was going on around.
Right.
So I don't know.
Yep.
I mean, it is left. There's questions that we'll never really know on this side of eternity.
Can't wait to find out. Yep. Can't wait to find out. This is one of those videos I want to jump into history, go back and relive this moment coming up here. So thank you, everyone. Until next time, we will leave Jesus in the grave, but we know how the story will end. So be encouraged. We'll talk again. And until then, have a blessed week. Thank you so much for your time and your effort to be part of this study in the book of John. We're close to finishing, and of course, next time we get to hear the good news that's about to happen. So until we talk again, have a good week. Thank you.